Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined once again by the great Nathan Jahnke. Nate, we're coming off a little bit early for the people here this past week as we record this week's episode earlier than when it's coming out. You're off to the NFL Combine. I'm just taking time off this week. So we're making sure we get an episode out. And with NFL free agency right around the corner, I figure it's a good time to kind of prep for that and provide a bit of a preview to some key positions for fantasy. So how are you doing? Looking forward to the Combine?
Oh, yeah, looking forward to it. Also, it already feels like fantasy season. Had my first mock draft of the year a couple of days ago with the guys at NFL Network. They put a mock draft together, so that was fun. Ended up drafting, I think, 7 rookies because I feel like everyone was not pricing them right. So I'm just like, I got Ashton Genty late second round, and I'm like, that's not going to happen any other time throughout the year. So that was fun, and almost was going to do a mock draft before this, but I'm like, I need to prep for the show so I can properly inform all of our listeners.
Yeah, there will be lots of time to mock draft throughout this offseason. It's going to be a long one as usual, but yeah, this will be fun. We'll get a chance to kind of look ahead here to free agency. Like I said, we're recording this a little bit earlier, so if something comes out in between February 19th and February whatever 26th or whatever when this comes out, then don't get too mad at us. We're just ahead here. But what we're going to do this episode, we're going to focus on the running back position for free agency. We're going to look at some of the top landing spots for running backs, who the free agent running backs even are. We've left out some of the RFA running backs, Nate, because like you mentioned, since they're most likely to remain with their same team, things like that. But we're going to go through the top free agent running backs first, and we'll talk about them. And this is kind of how you have them ranked in your early 2025 fantasy rankings right now. So we'll get right into it, and we'll start right at the top here with Aaron Jones. Played with the Minnesota Vikings last year. Pending free agent. We'll see if Minnesota works out a deal with him. But no running back in this year's free agent class played more offensive snaps than Aaron Jones last year, 700, making him arguably the most valuable back that any of these teams could potentially lose this offseason. Now, Jones he's kind of well past the ideal age for running backs in the NFL at 30 years old, and we did kind of see a decline in efficiency this past season. 76.5 rushing grade was the lowest of his career, as was his 4.4 yards per carry. That being said, he's still been incredibly consistent for fantasy. He finished as the PPR RB14 this past year, was a top 12 running back in PPR from 2019 to 2022, dealt with injuries in 2023, but I'd say bounced back nicely in 2024 relative to, his age and expectations. So still some gas left in the tank with Jones, and while the betting favorite probably for landing spot is probably to go back to Minnesota, I think wherever he lands, he'll have some fantasy relevancy regardless. What do you think about Aaron Jones heading into free agency?
I think he's, out of all the running backs, we'll talk about the one that we can trust the most to remain a quality player. I know, like you said, he had his career low in terms of rushing grade, but his career low is still better than basically all of the other guys that we're talking about and what they did in terms of rushing grade this past year. So still a very good running back. I think injuries have been one of the things with him these past 2 years. But I think him at his best is still a very good running back. I don't think we've seen signs of him really slowing down when he's been recovered from his injuries. So I think he is still playing at a high level. Even though age is definitely a factor, he has been someone that throughout his career, he's been used in committees here and there. So it doesn't have quite as much wear and tear compared to other running backs who are of 30 years old or older. But he did deal with a lot of injuries, but they were all kind of unrelated injuries. This year was a hip injury, a rib injury, and a quad injury. Year before, a hamstring, MCL. So luckily, no reoccurring things. It's just one thing after another thing after another thing that have kept him out here and there. So I think he can definitely be a team's top running back this upcoming season. Just worried that a team might pair him with another running back, and he might not see quite as much playing time as you saw with the Vikings this past year when he was the 14th running back in fantasy points, 20th in points per game. So still someone I think should be a fantasy starter this year, just maybe not quite what we've seen in the past few years.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then we're going to talk about like favorite landing spots and stuff like that, or things that we think might be likely for these players in a little bit. So I'll talk a little bit more about Aaron Jones then, and kind of alluding to what you talked about as well, and a potential shared workload a little bit. But there's also a chance that, again, it should still be fantasy starter quality, and even the chance that he can carry the workload like he kind of did this past year for the Vikings. So that's Aaron Jones, but we'll talk next about another free agent running back here, Najee Harris, played for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think Najee Harris may be the most intriguing free agent running back this year because he's relatively like young enough where he's turning 27 years old, arguably playing better than he has through his first 4 years in the league. That maybe there's more than like a 1-year contract in the mix, and even if it's just a 1-year deal, probably comes in as the team that signs him as their starter. But what do you think about Najee heading into free agency?
I think first thing, his consistency is pretty remarkable. I know in fantasy we don't talk about that quite as much, or talk about how kind of remarkable it is that he's been able to stay healthy. He has played all 68 games that he could have possibly played in his NFL career so far, and at the running back position, we don't see that in any other running back. So I think teams will value that as well. He's just been a very consistent 15 carries per game each season, averaging right around 4 yards per carry. So kind of a running back that does a lot of the dirty work, which isn't always the most valuable for fantasy. I think the interesting thing there is in his rookie season, we saw him heavily used in the passing game, and we just haven't seen it the past couple of years because Jaylen Warren has had that role and has gotten all of the passing work. So I think he is someone who will most likely end up in some kind of a two-man committee where he's probably not seeing the passing down work, and therefore will be right around this borderline RB2, RB3 player who doesn't have a ton of upside. But there is at least a chance that he will land on a team that will use him more as a feature running back than what we saw in Pittsburgh, in which case he could be more of a top 15 or so running back. So I think that range of possibilities is definitely there. I think I'll get a solid enough contract. My only concern is we do have a very good rookie running back class, so he might not see the money he wants. And because of that, it might be a while before he signs, and it might lead to other teams turning in other directions, and that could lead to a lot of problems. And then Harris ends up in a pretty stacked backfield where he's only doing the dirty work, and that means he might not be that fantasy relevant. So a wide range of possibilities, but there is definitely that higher upside range of possibilities. FA team is willing to put their trust in him both in the run game and the pass game.
Yeah, I think that's what makes him so interesting to me too, right? Is like there is such a wide range of possibilities here, and I mean, for all these like free agent running backs, all of them are in danger of losing a potential spot to a free or to a rookie running back because, like you said, this running back class does have a lot of potential starters in it. But yeah, like one of the things for me, like you mentioned, was the reliability of Najee Harris with the Steelers here over the past few years, having not missed a single game in his career at a position, like you said, that deals with so many injuries. I think that's a pretty impressive feat, and I think teams are going to find value in that reliability. And then the other part of it, like I mentioned earlier, is like he's steadily improved his rushing grade every year of his career. And he's not necessarily like among the elite at the position. It's just kind of promising that like he hasn't really declined already or dropped off in any sort of way. So you could kind of point to his numbers and identify him as not only like reliable, but maybe can squeeze some RB1 performances out of him with the right usage, right? And I think landing spot, like you said, is going to be a big part of that because we saw him splitting time with Jaylen Warren the last 2 years or so, and he might have some workhorse potential in him still for a team in need. We saw that with him as a rookie, and it just depends on the landing spot if a team is going to utilize him in that role. So I think there's that potential, but like you said, there's a lot of possibilities with Najee Harris, and I think just we got to keep an eye on where he's going to go. But we got a couple landing spots for him that we'll talk about later on. All right, next up is Rico Dowdle, who was with the Dallas Cowboys last season and not someone that is likely going to be on like the top of our free agent ranking list, but he was a top 20 running back in PFF WAR this past season. He tied with Najee Harris and Aaron Jones for 18th on that list. And he did that because he handled 70% of all of Dallas's running back carries this past season, accounting for 77% of their total running back rushing yards. So he was a big part of that Cowboys offense and looked pretty good doing so. He ran for over 1,000 yards, posted a 74.4 rushing grade, 4.6 yards per carry, which was a top 10 mark in the regular season among 27 backs with at least 50% of the team's carry. So what do you think, Nate? What are the chances that Dowdle goes somewhere other than Dallas and serves as a lead back again in 2025?
I think it's at least possible. First off, it was impressive to see him do so well this year, considering this time a year ago, he wasn't really on anyone's fantasy radars. No one thought that he'd be the starting running back for the Cowboys. So the fact that he did relatively well, considering the circumstances, was impressive in itself. He is an interesting running back in that he does a lot of the hard things well, but a lot of the easy things he didn't do as well compared to other running backs. He's excellent when there's 8 men in the box. When it's not a perfectly blocked play, he does better than most running backs, but when it's a 7-man box or on the perfectly blocked plays, he doesn't do as well compared to other running backs. So I think he definitely has value in some backfield. Was pretty even in terms of how good he was on gap plays compared to zone plays. So I think he can end up in pretty much any rushing scheme and have some value. I think a lot of the running backs that we will talk about, or even like we just talked about Najee Harris has a very specific role that we know he'll have on a team. Dowdle, I think, could have kind of any role. I could see him being someone getting double-digit carries again. I could also see him being a clear backup and having to do some more of that dirty work and only getting 6 or 7 carries per game. But I think he's kind of a player that any team that needs a running back can put him in and have him be part of the team, where a lot of these other running backs, there are more specific landing spots for them. So Dowdle, someone who I don't think will be a clear fantasy starter at the start of the season, but if there's an injury, if a starting running back isn't doing well, I think Dowdle could definitely step into not just the NFL team starting lineup, but also fantasy starting lineups.
Yeah, he kind of stands out as one to me where, like, I feel like a team in need of running back will probably sign him. It probably won't cost as much as some of the other running backs that are in to hit free agency here, but then also get potentially nuked by one of these incoming rookie running backs as well. Like I just kind of see this kind of path for him. But there's a lot of possibilities for all these guys. And next up we have J.K. Dobbins, who has dealt with a ton of injuries throughout his NFL career. He's missed significant time. So even when he gets his shot as a starter on a team, he's just kind of been unable to hold that role down, being in and out of the lineup. So he'll look for a new team in free agency. He got over 200 carries for the first time in his career in 2024. So can he build on that in 2025, Nate, potentially with a new team? What do you think about Dobbins here?
I think it's certainly possible. I think Dobbins, out of the 4 running backs we've talked about, maybe has the most upside out of all of these players. Was 18th in fantasy points per game this past year, so was playing decently well when he was on the field. But when you look at his grade or any of his rushing stats, compared his 2024 season to his 2022 season, everything was down a little bit. But this was a season where Dobbins was coming back from injury. Sometimes it takes a year. So there's definitely a possibility that Dobbins might be far enough removed from his significant injuries that he could get back to the same player he was at times in Baltimore, which was a pretty excellent running back. The only difference this year compared to his years in Baltimore is he was running the ball more often, which it was good to see him get that volume, but he has had those injuries. But he's only 26 years old. The thing with Dobbins, though, is because of his injury history, I have a hard time viewing a team adding Dobbins and just being comfortable with Dobbins being the lead back. If you're picking up Dobbins as a team, you need to have another running back just in case Dobbins is dealing with those injuries again. So I think a team that has Dobbins will have to have another running back, where a team could potentially add Dowdle and have him be the lead running back like the Cowboys did last year. I don't see a team doing that same kind of thing with Dobbins.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And we've, like you said, we've seen him be more efficient than he was in 2024. But, every back is more efficient with the Ravens in the Lamar Jackson era. So the main thing for me was like that I found encouraging was just how much more he was able to play. Even if he missed some time this past year, it was a big improvement for him, than previous years where he hadn't had 150 carries in a season since his rookie year. It also helped that, the Chargers were a running back needy team and one that wanted to run the ball, but promising either way, even had it like a 7-game touchdown streak into the playoffs. So he could be effective. He can be, kind of trusted in key situations, maybe gets another shot to start with the right landing spot in 2025. But I think, like you said, one of the key things here for any team signing him is going to have, somebody else waiting as well that could potentially help carry the load or step into a starting role. So there'll be some competition, I think, there for Dobbins wherever he lands. Okay, Nick Chubb hits the open market for the first time in his career now. And I think, if it wasn't for the significant knee injury in 2023, he'd probably be much higher on this list. But as we know, that knee injury definitely kept Chubb from getting back to his true form in 2024 as expected. He didn't play until week 7 and posted by far the lowest PFF grades of his entire career, just a 57.5 overall when he was never lower than 81 before, then a 62.5 rushing grade when he was never below 80, and had been one of our highest graded running backs prior to that injury. So obviously nowhere close to the Nick Chubb that we know and love, but he'll be another year removed from that knee injury, 29 years old, so on the older side. But we've seen these high-end running backs perform at a high level, even in their 30s. You don't have to look further than, like Derrick Henry this past season, but these are also typically guys that are not necessarily having the devastating injury baggage potentially factoring in now later in their careers. So we'll see how Chubb looks. I'm sure he'll have his suitors, and I think he'll be better than he was this past season, though, again, probably not a high bar to clear for him. Whether he can get back to that fantasy relevance will probably just depend on landing spot usage and just how much age and injury are going to be a factor. So probably has more going against him than others, but where are you at with Chubb heading into free agency, Nate?
Yeah, it's hard. I think he'll be able to find a good landing spot, and I think he'll be able to carve out a role in an offense. In his first 6 games back, he was consistently averaging 3.3 yards per carry or less, so was not great at all in terms of his rushing. But then his last 2 games of the season, he averaged 4.4 and 4.6 yards per carry. So we started to see things get a little bit better before he suffered a foot injury that cost him the last 3 games of the season. So we started to see it a little bit. I think part of it is he needs that good offensive line. The Browns' offensive line has been in decline, so Chubb is, if you combine kind of the 2022, 2024 seasons, he is someone who, when there was perfectly blocked runs, was excellent, and when there was not perfectly blocked runs, then he struggled a bit. So the decline in the offensive line was also playing a big role in Chubb not performing as well this year. So part of me having him this low on the list is the other running backs we talked about. There's a chance they return to their team, and they were all top 25 or so running backs with their teams last year. So there's a chance they could do the same thing again this upcoming year if they re-sign. I don't see Chubb being able to re-sign with the Browns and being able to be that fantasy relevant running back because of the offensive line that Cleveland has. I think he needs to go to a team with a better offensive line in order to get some of that fantasy relevancy back. And I think with Chubb, it's also worth remembering that throughout his career, he has not been a receiving back at all. He has been able to stay a pretty great fantasy running back because of how well he is at running the ball, and he was running behind an excellent offensive line. So even if he does land with the new team, I don't see him having as much receiving production as the other running backs we've talked about. And he was able to overcome that before because of how excellent he was. But if he's just a good runner, it's going to be hard to overcome that if he doesn't become more of a receiver.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, if we're looking at, I guess, running backs who we've seen kind of struggle to bounce back from injuries and maybe younger ones than Nick Chubb as well, Javonte Williams is a good example of that, where he had this amazing college production profile, looked really good in his rookie season in the NFL, and then the knee injury happened, and we haven't seen him even get close to how effective he looked as a rookie or what his college profile told us he could be, which is just the nature of injuries a lot of the time. But I think for Williams, a change of scenery is needed and could be key in getting him back on track. He's not even going to be 25 years old by the time free agency opens up. So there could be some teams who see some like RB1 potential in him in the right system. But what do you think, Nick?
Oh, yeah, I think we have to see something of him, what we saw early in his career in college in his rookie year, because we haven't really seen it the past 3 years, was trying to look at numbers in different situations and nothing was really standing out. He started the season, was consistently getting those double-digit carry games, did it in 6 of the first 9 games of the season. But then in those last 9 games, he was averaging less than 5 carries per game. So largely phased out of the Broncos rushing attack throughout the season. Was our lowest graded runner among those with at least 100 carries this past season. So definitely think he needs a change of scenery. Seems like someone who maybe that change of scenery helps him and he's able to recover of what we saw much earlier in his career, but also a chance that if he doesn't and fizzles out with the new team, he might be out of the league in a year or two from now.
Yeah, like you said, it kind of got phased out of the rushing attack, but he was still utilized quite a bit like as a receiver, which kind of helped him a little bit. Like no player in this free agent class for running back saw more targets in 2024 was 66 than Javonte Williams. So Denver utilized him like on passing downs, which I guess is, promising for fantasy. If he lands somewhere with a need for, an every down back or receiving down back, maybe he can deliver in that role, which would be a big boost for his fantasy value. I think it's just going to, like you said, take that return to form to probably keep that role and to stay in the league as well. Okay, we got a few other names here that are maybe lesser for fantasy purposes, but we'll kind of go over them, and we'll start with Kareem Hunt, who, older running back who seemingly didn't have the market during the offseason last year, but the Isaiah Pacheco injury kind of forced the Chiefs' hand to kind of bring him in. He was fairly productive, but again, it helps to be part of a productive offense as well. So I think he'll end up being, maybe a product of his environment again if he signs with the team this offseason, or do you think he'll be able to deliver regardless of where he lands if it's the right situation?
I think he is someone who is at this point of his career able to do some of the dirty work. He was pretty decent at getting first downs this past year, which helped him have a decent overall rushing grade, but he doesn't make the big plays. He does not get carries of 10 plus yards, 15 plus yards at any kind of high rate. Anything like that. He doesn't avoid tackles very much at this point in his career. So all of those things lead to a running back that's not going to be fantasy relevant. I think a big thing with this free agency in general is some of these running backs might lose some of their fantasy value in free agency. The big thing will be who are they taking fantasy value away from, since they'll land on teams that we might not expect, some teams that have good running backs and therefore might lose some value. So like if he returns to Kansas City, that's not great for Isaiah Pacheco. If he lands on some other team, that's probably not great for whoever their running back is, because Hunt is someone who can see that 7 to 10 to 13 carries a game and help grind the game out, not get a lot of fantasy production, but take carries away from someone else who is going to make some big plays and needs those other runs to help increase their fantasy production. So I think Hunt is someone who will stay in the NFL, will end with the team, have some role with the team, but might just not be that fantasy relevant with the team.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think, a lot of these guys here that are also on the list, it's not like a deep free agent running back class this year. We talked about, probably the most interesting names there, but there's some other names that are going to pop up. Raheem Mostert is expected to be released here from the Miami Dolphins. They let him know. We saw him kind of phased out of the offense a little bit as the season went on. There's Elijah Mitchell, who missed all of the 2024 season with an injury, as did A.J. Dillon after he signed a one-year deal with Green Bay. Then you got guys like Alexander Madison, who he had a role for the Raiders, but I mean, they really had no other choice because they had nobody in that backfield. And then there was Khalil Herbert, who got traded from Chicago to Cincinnati and then never really factored into their offense. So any of these 5 guys here that are probably the last 5 worth kind of discussing here, anybody that you'd want to get into detail here or you have hope for fantasy purposes, Nate?
First, I will mention Mostert was officially released, so he is actually able to sign with the team now if he wants to. All 5 of these guys have graded well at some point in their career. A lot of them, it was more like 2 years ago that they graded well. Like Elijah Mitchell has only played less than 300 snaps over the past 3 seasons, but anytime he has seen the field, he's graded well. A.J. Dillon is someone who in 2021, 2022 was grading from like the 88 to 90 range in terms of his rushing. So was grading very well, had a little bit of a down 2023 and then missed all of 2024. So certainly a chance he's able to turn things around. And then like Madison, Herbert, both guys that like earlier in their career, they graded well, did not grade well this past year, limited opportunities this past year as well. So a chance that like they could at least have some kind of value as a backup on some team. But I always remind myself now that like Amir Abdullah was a fantasy relevant running back at the end of last year. So there can be some of these guys who we don't think too much of that were a running back that had some role earlier in their career, smaller role later in their career, but injuries happen all the time. These guys will end up making some rosters, will be backups on the team more likely than not, but all it takes is an injury to a starter, and all of a sudden these backs will be relevant. Like even last year, Kareem Hunt wasn't on the team until a couple weeks into the season, and then ends up being someone who, for parts of the season, was seeing double-digit carries each week. So volume matters in fantasy football. Most of the running backs who are starters on their team are fantasy starters. If you're in a 12-team league that starts 2 running backs and has a flex spot, so even if we're not considering drafting these running backs in our fantasy drafts come August, they are still people who could be on fantasy radars at some point during the 2025 season.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a position where opportunity matters more than other positions, right? And with such a high injury rate as well, like any of these guys can kind of step in and be relevant for us for fantasy purposes. So just names to kind of keep an eye on here as we head into free agency and kind of getting a feel for maybe the backs ahead of them on the depth chart as well. So those are kind of the free agent running backs. We'll talk about maybe some of the better situations or more running back needy teams here in a second. But first, a quick word from our sponsor, Fabric by Gerber Life. The new year is a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything, benefiting your child from tuition and tutors to music classes. And when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, meetfabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. Okay, we've covered who the top free agent running backs are for this year's class. Now it's important to kind of go over some of the more, I guess, running back needy offenses where these players could land this offseason. We've kind of ranked and tiered them here, Nate, but let's start with the 2 teams that you've kind of identified as not having a clear top running back. That's the Denver Broncos and the Las Vegas Raiders. The Broncos losing Javonte Williams, the Raiders losing Amir Abdullah and Alexander Madison. So what has got you hating on Audric Estime?
Oh, well, the Broncos were throughout the season, throughout the year. We were hoping that he would get more carries, and it just never happened. So that's more how the Denver Broncos viewed him more so than how we view him. So these 2 teams are the ones that throughout the year, it was unclear who their starting running back was going to be from one week to the next. It seemed like something that was constantly changing or something that we wouldn't know heading into the game. So I think both teams definitely looking for running backs this year. I think with Denver, the thing to remember is Sean Payton does have that long history with running backs. Even though we haven't seen it in these 2 years with Denver, we have seen the offense start to turn around, and it just hasn't been the running backs that have turned things around yet. So I could still see them adding a running back or 2 and being able to have very fantasy relevant players. They have the 10th highest team run block grade this past season. And Sean Payton turned Reggie Bush, Darren Sproles, Mark Ingram, and Alvin Kamara all into players who were top 10 fantasy running backs at some point in their career. At multiple times, they were, they had it over multiple seasons. And then they also had, in 5 of his 14 years there, 2 running backs who ended up in the top 24 in fantasy points in a year. Another 5 years where they had 2 running backs in the top 36. So even though he is very well known for having committees of running backs, and we've definitely seen that these past 2 years in Denver, they've been able to have multiple fantasy relevant running backs throughout his time with the Saints. And I could see Denver bringing in a running back or 2, and then both of them becoming fantasy relevant this season.
Yeah, there'll be interesting teams to watch for sure, and into the draft as well. Because, yeah, I mean, like you said, I'm an Estime fan. I don't think Jaleel McLaughlin is bad, but it clearly doesn't seem like those are necessarily going to be lead backs for the Broncos. And the Raiders don't have anyone either, unless you believe in Sincere McCormick can maybe replicate his little stretch as a starter across an entire season. But we just saw them trust that process with Zamir White last year, and it did not last long. So I don't think a new coaching staff is going to remain status quo there by any means. Maybe it's the draft, maybe it's free agency, but there for sure will be I think a new running back in Vegas and potentially Denver as well, who will get a shot to start in 2025. And then the next,
I was going to say Chip Kelly, their new offensive coordinator, when he was in the NFL, all 4 years, he had a top 20 fantasy running back. Yeah. LaShawn McCoy for 2 years, including a season at RB2. DeMarco Murray that last year with Philadelphia, and then Carlos Hyde as 1 year with San Francisco. So he very consistently had one clear running back who ended up being very fantasy relevant. So it'll be interesting to see who lands there.
Definitely. And then the next group of teams are ones that had one of those UFA running backs on the team last season and could be losing those players to the open market, making them kind of a good destination to shake things up and bring in a new starter for the 2025 season and maybe longer. We're looking at Dallas, Pittsburgh, Minnesota, Cleveland, and the Chargers, Nate. All of these teams kind of intrigue in their own way. Should they bring in a new 2025 starter? What do you think?
Yeah, I think various levels of how good the team is, how good of a running back they might bring in, what their histories are with running backs. One team that I was digging a bit into was Dallas, and Brian Schottenheimer as the new head coach. He has a long history of being offensive coordinators with a number of teams, and I know the success of the offenses hasn't always been there, but in terms of the fantasy success of the running backs, he has pretty consistently had a top 20 fantasy running back, and it's been a collection of interesting names. Thomas Jones, 2 years as a top 6 fantasy running back. LaDainian Tomlinson at the end of his career. Sean Green, then he went to the Rams where he had Steven Jackson at the end of his career. Zach Stacy for a season. Trey Mason for a season. Mason, one of the only backs that wasn't able to reach the top 20 in fantasy points. Seahawks, 3 years with Chris Carson, all top 18 fantasy seasons with Carson, and then with the Cowboys, Tony Pollard, and then Rico Dowdle this past year. So very consistently had a clear running back as someone who was fantasy relevant. Not very often a top 10 fantasy running back, but a lot of those names weren't necessarily players you would expect to be in the top 10, except for parts earlier in their career before he was in that offense. So I think that's an interesting landing spot. I think the Chargers is another one just because Greg Roman very consistently had top 10 running backs as well. Ravens, 8th most in rushing yards. His 2 years with the Bills, they had the most rushing yards by running backs. 4 years with the 49ers, 10th most rushing yards by a running back. So I think those are probably the 2 most interesting landing spots for fantasy. I think the roughest one is Cleveland. Their offensive line has declined each year in terms of their run block grade. They were the top team in 2020. That's gone all the way down to the 3rd worst team this past year. All 5 of their starting offensive linemen last year all had down years. All will be at least 30 years old by the start of the season. They've only spent 1 draft pick on the first 2 days of the draft on an offensive lineman in the past 4 drafts. So don't really have that many potential offensive linemen to take over for some of these older players. So that's probably one where I'm a little bit more concerned.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And like you said with the Chargers, they're an interesting spot. I mean, they're the only team among this, tier 1 and tier 2 landing spots that we talked about that was top 10 in the league in run rate. Like you said, we know that with Greg Roman being in there. Dallas for sure. I mean, they did nothing in free agency last year. Ashton Jeanty has been mocked to Dallas more than maybe any player has been mocked anywhere in this year's draft. But maybe Jerry and company they'll have their eye on someone else in the draft and will look to free agency to address the running back position instead. So we don't really know there. And then with the Steelers, Jaylen Warren, he's a pending RFA on top of Najee Harris being a UFA. So maybe Warren sticks around, but there's still going to be a need there considering that Najee Harris handled like 263 carries and accounted for over 1,000 rushing yards for them this season. So the Steelers, they were a top 5 run rate team in 2024. So yeah, so them and the Chargers, I guess. But they want to run it, so they'll need Warren to do that. But yeah, other than that, I mean, Minnesota, Aaron Jones, Cam Akers, both free agents. They both had their carries in this past season. And then Nick Chubb and Deontay Foreman in Cleveland are gone. The role itself in Cleveland, like we've seen them lean a lot on Nick Chubb before where, these past couple of years, it's been a bit more of a committee. So I think it depends on the player that they bring in. If they have somebody that's capable of doing that, I just don't know that there's maybe many in this year's free agent class that's really can play that role. So we'll have to see how things shake out there.
Yeah, and like Minnesota, Kevin O'Connell's been interesting. Like each year, it seems like they've had a different approach to running backs. With Washington, they had Adrian Peterson and Darius Geis. With the Rams, it was at times one clear running back, but at times it was more of a committee and no consistent running back over a long stretch of time during his 2 years with the Rams. And then the Vikings, it was Dalvin Cook for 1 year. Then 2023, it was a mess of a situation. Then Aaron Jones last year, but then Cam Akers started to get more of a role, particularly when Jones was having injuries. And at Jones's age, that might be more of a committee. So I think there's a wide range of possibilities of what could happen with Minnesota. Like maybe they don't re-sign Aaron Jones. Maybe they don't add a free agent. Maybe they become this ideal landing spot for a rookie running back. So I think a lot of these teams in general, they could add one of these free agents, but also if they don't add a free agent, then we're going to be talking about them a ton in April of let's hope our favorite running back gets drafted by this team, because then that could be a huge situation for them.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of that. I think even, for teams that bring in running backs in free agency, I think this running back class here for the rookies coming in are going to make a pretty big dent into how we view this their backfields heading into 2025. But lastly, a few bonus name teams here to kind of keep an eye on, Nate. The Chicago Bears, New York Giants, and Indianapolis Colts, all teams who don't necessarily stand out as far as like vacated running back usage via free agency, but you think could still be in the market for some running back help this offseason.
Yeah, like we were just saying with the rookies, a lot of these teams are going to target rookies over veterans. So that'll leave some veterans that can be kind of a luxury pickup for some teams. So a lot of teams might already have a starter, and bringing someone in who could have a big role. The first team that I've highlighted is Chicago. A big thing there is Ben Johnson is the new head coach there. There was 1 year in Detroit where he was offensive coordinator and DeAndre Swift was their running back. Swift had a career low in terms of rushing attempts per game that season, as well as just total rushing attempts with 7 rushing attempts per game compared to 11.6 the year before. Has had at least 14 each of the past 2 years. So seems like Ben Johnson that 1 year viewed Swift as more of a receiving back. So we could see that happen. That 1 year was the one where Jamal Williams had more touchdowns that year than all of the rest of his 7 years in the NFL combined. So could very well see Swift either being a receiving back for Chicago, unlike this past year, in which case they need a new early down back, or Roschon Johnson could become that early down back. I don't see Swift getting released from the team just for salary cap reasons, but there is a chance he could get traded. And it was a team with the 7th lowest team rushing grade, so the running backs didn't perform all that well this past year. And then both Indianapolis and New York, both teams in the bottom 3 in terms of team run grade. Part of that's been just injuries with Jonathan Taylor. graded very well his first 2 years with Indianapolis, not quite as well these past 3, and there's been a lot of injuries. Trey Sermon's a free agent. I don't see them moving away from Jonathan Taylor at all, but I think they definitely could use a second running back just to give Taylor a little bit more of a rest here and there, as well as insurance for if Taylor suffers another injury. And then with the Giants, we saw Tyrone Tracy take over as the starter. Didn't grade all that well as the starter, so I wouldn't rule them out as a team looking to upgrade at the running back position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Chicago, like you said, is probably the most interesting team for me from this group. Like you said, according to Over the Cap, they can't really save money by cutting Swift pre or post June 1st, but that changes if they are able to trade him. They could save something like over $6 million, it seems. But Swift, like you said, he has some ties to Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was part of the Lions coaching staff when they drafted him back in 2020, but he was also a bigger part of that coaching staff when they traded him away in the 2023 offseason, right? So, yeah, not sure if they'll be completely sold on Swift as a starter. I don't know that Swift did anything in 2024 with the Bears that would really help his case either. So maybe the Bears will be one of those teams to kind of keep an eye on. I think potentially more maybe in the draft to save some money, since Swift is kind of an above average contract for the position, but maybe they can get one of these cheaper free agent running backs to kind of come in there and handle the workload, at least on early downs. Okay, we're going to get into our ideal landing spots for our free agent running backs as well. This is kind of, again, it's a fantasy football podcast. We're doing a fantasy version of free agency here. We're looking at new landing spots, not necessarily keeping players with the same team. We both picked out 3 players / landing spots each. And Nate, this is where you really get to appreciate my graphic design work here. As you know, it's top-notch stuff. But we're going to start with Najee Harris, who is our one of our more intriguing names of free agency. We both have a different landing spot for him. You have selected the Dallas Cowboys for Najee Harris. So what do you like about Najee potentially going to Dallas?
So one big thing with Harris is when I look at how he's performed by situation, the one situation where he has been by far better than the other situations relative to the other running backs in the league is on zone plays. So I think him landing on a team that likes to run a lot of zone will be beneficial for Harris. That means the Steelers might be one of the better landing spots because of how much Arthur Smith was running those zone plays. But I think the Cowboys will also be a team that runs a lot of zone. The 5th highest rate of using it last year. When Schottenheimer was with the Seahawks and in charge of the offense, they were the 6th highest rate of using zone. So I think that's probably a decent situation for Harris. And in terms of opportunity where he can have a big role, I know a lot of people have mocked running backs to the Cowboys, but if they want to go with Harris and use their draft picks elsewhere, there's a chance Harris could have a really big role in this Cowboys offense.
Yeah, I like it potential-wise for fantasy for sure. And that's kind of what I was thinking for Harris, opportunity for him. So I went with the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders were the worst rushing team in the NFL this past season. They ranked dead last in PFF rushing grade as a team, 56.5, and in rushing yards per attempt at 3.6. So Najee Harris, among this year's free agent class at running back, he's arguably the top available starter. It's right there with Aaron Jones. If you're looking at guys who had at least 120 carries, he earned the top rushing grade of the group with a 79.3. That was a career high for him. So potentially still could be even better than that at this stage in his career. The Raiders, you think about them too, they have a number of team needs that need to be addressed. I think potentially in the draft, and I think saving a crucial draft pick, which they're picking 6th overall, or an early 2nd rounder, by not spending that on a running back and bringing in a 27-year-old Harris could make sense. He's run for over 1,000 yards in all 4 of his NFL regular seasons. He offers enough passing down potential, at least from what we saw early in his career, where maybe he can handle a significant workload for a rebuilding franchise and be good enough in that role to deliver weekly starter fantasy production. So, I guess I kind of like Najee Harris for the Raiders. But you got a different running back for the Raiders, Nate. I went with one of the relatively younger backs here. You went with one of the relatively older backs here for the running back position. You like Raheem Mostert with Las Vegas. What do you like about this fit?
Yes, and some of the top running backs we talked about, I think, will either re-sign with their team or someone like Rico Dowdle, who I think could kind of fit with any team. Mostert is one that I think seems pretty likely to land with the Raiders, so I included it more so because I want to say I'm right in a couple weeks from now when the move actually happens. But the big thing for me is Mostert has a history with Chip Kelly already, was with the Eagles as well as with the 49ers. They brought Mostert in, so I think Chip Kelly had a decent role in the start of Mostert's career. And because of that, I could see kind of a full circle moment of Kelly getting to end Mostert's career, because Mostert probably does not have many landing spots yet left. He will be 33 by the start of the season, so he is already older than we expect a running back to be in the NFL. Chip Kelly, he is someone who kind of has had different schemes throughout his time in college and the NFL, so I could see the Raiders going in a lot of different directions. But Mostert, we had just seen a year prior in 2023 was one of the top fantasy running backs in the NFL. Maybe has lost a little bit of a step in there, but I think Mostert can still be a quality player. I don't think he'll be the main running back with the Raiders. I think the Raiders, if they bring in Mostert, would also draft someone, make it a two-back committee. But I think Mostert can still be relevant with the Raiders, and especially if they spend more of a middle round draft pick, it could be something where Mostert's the starter early on in the season and then just kind of loses playing time as the season progresses.
Yeah, when I saw this one as one of your picks, I was like, okay, this is the one that I think makes the most sense, like is most likely to happen as far as, all of our picks here. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if Raheem Mostert lands with the Las Vegas Raiders. So yeah, like that fit there. And then for me, another one that I picked, so I was looking at Javonte Williams, and I wanted to put him on the Minnesota Vikings. They're potentially losing Aaron Jones. We'll see what happens there. I think, like you said, there's a chance that Aaron Jones re-signs with Minnesota, but they'd also be potentially retaining Sam Darnold at quarterback. So it creates a little bit of a need there that Darnold and the Vikings passing game really relied on quite a bit in 2024, where they'd be losing about 91% of their team running back targets between Aaron Jones and Cam Akers, which is the most of any team heading into free agency. And you add in a player like Javonte Williams to the mix now, who has a little bit of youth on his side, as well as the ability to not just, maybe run the ball again. We talked about, the potential for a bounce back with a fresh start, but also the one running back who led this free agent class in targets and receptions during the regular season, both of which were top 6 marks at the position as a whole. Again, assuming they don't bring back Aaron Jones, who they know works in this system and can be effective, I think Javonte stands out to me as the one that makes the most sense. And you pointed out before as well, has some ties to the coaching staff with the Minnesota running back coach, Curtis Modkins. He was Javonte's running back coach during his rookie season with the Denver Broncos. And we've seen familiarity matter with teams bringing in free agents at all positions. And with that rookie year being the best version of Javonte, maybe there's a belief that, Modkins can get him back to that form.
Yeah, he's someone where, like, I sent you the message as well of like, hey, if we want a fourth one, this is what I'm thinking because of the coaching thing. And I think even if Aaron Jones resigns there, it makes sense for Minnesota to have a second back. So I think having a pair of Aaron Jones and Williams could do nice things for the Vikings.
Yeah, that could be fun. Another one that we'll talk about here, the Los Angeles Chargers. We talked about them being, one of the more run-heavy teams. They want to run the ball. We didn't see A.J. Dillon last season, but you think he could be a nice fit here for what the Chargers want to do in 2025, Nate?
Yeah, I think he could be an upgrade to Gus Edwards and that kind of role in the offense. We've seen them like to use kind of a heavier back and be able to do some nice things there. Dillon, one of the bigger running backs in the league. They can release Edwards if they want and get most of that cap space back. So I think Dillon could very well fill that role. The Chargers had one of the kind of more diverse usages of run concepts. They had a very high rate relative to other teams in terms of traps and powers and counters. Those are all things where Dillon throughout his career has graded fairly well on those kinds of runs. So I think both the scheme fit could do well in terms of what they've liked in running backs in the past could do well. So I think Dillon could be part of kind of a 2-back committee with the Chargers if they decide to move on from Gus Edwards.
Nice. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then last one for me, we got to talk about Aaron Jones potentially going somewhere other than Minnesota. So I was thinking about the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, depending on what happens with Jaylen Warren, again, he's an RFA. They could bring him back. But if not, they could potentially be losing like 90% of their team running back rushing production to free agency if both Harris and Jaylen Warren depart, leaving a pretty big hole in that backfield, obviously. Now, the combination of Harris and Warren gave the Steelers kind of two backs to deploy in different situations, one as a runner and one more a little bit as a receiver. But if you have one reliable running back that could, play both roles and you could save resources to help elsewhere, depending on if they keep Warren as an RFA or, if Warren does stay in Pittsburgh, then you can help manage Jones's workload a little bit, at least by keeping Warren in that kind of relief role or receiving specific role, which I think helps, a 30-year-old running back like Aaron Jones kind of keep him fresh and most effective. So, keeping in mind that Jones is coming off a season where he had 408 receiving yards, over 1,100 rushing yards, both of which are the most among any running back in this year's free agent class. And if you're looking, at the highest graded free agent running backs over the past 3 seasons combined, Jones is the top name with a 91.8 rushing grade. So definitely someone capable of carrying the workload if needed. Even at 30 years old, like he isn't going to be a long-term option, but if they're looking to compete again in 2025, giving that roster maybe one more go under Mike Tomlin, then, a reliable every down back like Jones, I think makes sense. Him getting one more shot at a starting role. He finished RB14, like I said before, in 2024. So I think he could be a fantasy starter again, probably not that high, but it'll depend if he goes to Pittsburgh and then also what Pittsburgh does with Jaylen Warren as well. But that's it. That's it for us, Nate. We've gone through a couple ideal landing spots. We talked about the favorite landing spots that are out there as far as teams that need running backs, and we've gone over this running back class. So not the deepest running back class for free agency. It's not like last year when we had guys like Saquon Barkley and Tony Pollard and Derrick Henry out there, right? Some big names that could definitely make an impact. But there's guys that, like you said, there's going to be potential for them to be fantasy starters at some point during the 2025 season, just given the nature of this position. So it'll be an interesting group to watch here as free agency opens up. But thank you everybody for watching and for listening and tuning in. So if you don't mind to like and subscribe to the Fantasy YouTube channel or leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, we would greatly appreciate that. Nate, it's for the sake of this episode, it's the week of February 24th to 28th. So what do you have going on at PFF.com this week?
I've got Dynasty rookie rankings up. We'll also have the mock draft of a hypothetical situation where it's the NFL draft and teams can only draft quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. So a nice fun exercise trying to fit the right schemes with running backs and wide receivers, along with going with team needs. So obviously teams will be able to draft players at other positions, but a fun thought exercise. So that is also up on the website. And we'll also be finding out tomorrow if I win a Fantasy Sports Writers Association award for a research article of the year last year. So was one of the 5 people nominated across all of fantasy, not just football. I think there was just one other football research article there. So hopefully we'll win that, but we will find out tomorrow.
Nice. Oh, well, tell us the article so people can find it as well.
Fair. It was an article I wrote last July. It was looking at utilization for wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends. It was specifically the wide receiver one I submitted for it, but it was a series of articles looking at different roles players have in their offenses and how that leads to fantasy success. So which players you should target and avoid based on their roles and their offenses.
Good stuff. Yeah. So good luck there. Hope you win that one. As for me, I'm off this week, but I have from the last 2 weeks up on the website looking at kind of how this year's rookie class stacks up using PFF's key stable metrics over the past 2 seasons. So looking at the quarterbacks, the running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and the edge defenders so far are all up on the site with a few more defensive positions coming up. So also in the podcast feed later this week, we'll have the IDP dynasty moves to make right now. That'll be coming later in the week. And then next week, we will have our free agency wide receiver preview episode, which will be fun. So looking forward to all that. Thank you all again for tuning in. And until next time, peace out.